When Donald Trump and his administration first stepped in the White House, they were quite clear about what they were going to do in foreign policy. From the first moment, they quite openly spoke about how overextended the United States is, and how it needs to withdraw from Europe, Middle East, Africa, and other areas where they felt they were wasting their resources, and how instead they need to focus on the one threat that, according to them, really matters: China, and especially its ambitions in the Indo Pacific and around Taiwan. In that sense, the withdrawal from Europe and other areas should not really come as a surprise, even though many, including myself, are not exactly excited about it. But Donald Trump did tell us beforehand, and they are essentially fulfilling their promise. But what's becoming clear now is that the second part of that story, that they're doing all this to be able to fully refocus and prioritize China, is, whether they actually ever meant it or not really happening. And instead, it looks less and less likely that Trump's administration would be actually willing to stand up to China and act in case of the decisive moment that both China and the US have been preparing for years: an attempt by China to take back Taiwan by force. And that's not good news for Taiwan. Actually, that's very, very bad news, both for its future and for any hopes it has for a continuation of its sovereign existence. But let me explain, and let's take it one step at a time. First, why am I skeptical that Trump would help Taiwan if China decided to act? Well, there is a number of reasons. For one, you have concrete policy steps like the new National Defense Strategy, which, according to Politico, should task the US military to focus on homeland threats and deprioritize adversaries like China and Russia. According to Politico, quote, Pentagon officials are proposing the department prioritize protecting the homeland and Western Hemisphere, a striking reversal from the military's year-long mandate to focus on the threat from China. A draft of the newest National Defense Strategy places domestic and regional missions above countering adversaries, such as Beijing and Moscow, according to 3 people briefed on early versions of the report. End of the quote. But even more importantly than just this, you have everything else that this administration is signaling, with both words and actions. What Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, Pete Hegseth, and almost every member of the administration has been repeating again and again is that the US should not be fighting costly wars in faraway countries they know nothing about. That the US does not have allies and values, only its own interests, and that it doesn't owe anything to anyone. Although Trump presented himself as a China hawk in his first term, this side of his seems a lot less prominent and visible in the second one. And while Trump likes to look tough in foreign policy, his actual track record in his second term, from its dealings with Russia to how his big trade war with China actually ended, doesn't really look like he's willing to put the money where his mouth is at the end of the day. And while no one knows what would actually happen if the push came to shove and Donald Trump had to decide whether he would go to war with China over Taiwan, and most likely neither does he, any Taiwanese politician or official would have to be extremely optimistic to, at this point, genuinely believe that the US would really come to help them. After all, if alliances and values mean nothing, and everything is just about self interests, is Taiwan really so indispensable for America, either because of its chip making or strategic location, that it would make sense for the US to go to war with another superpower over it? I might be wrong, but I have a feeling like I know what Donald Trump's answer might be, and I feel that this would be a relatively easy decision for him to make, and it would not be one that Taiwan would be happy about. And while this is not yet really something that would be talked about too much, it's not that surprising conclusion to arrive at least if you look at everything that the current US administration is saying, doing, and seems to believe in. And if I arrived at this conclusion, I'm pretty sure that some smart folks in Beijing, and in Taipei as well, will do too. And that will, especially if all this will become increasingly more obvious, mark a pretty fundamental shift for Taiwan's strategic situation, its deterrence strategy up till now, and its future in general. The thing is that although the United States have always maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity, as it was called, when it comes to defense of Taiwan, there's always been an assumption in Taipei, Beijing, and in Washington that this nevertheless means that the US would join the fight, although no one wanted to say that out loud. And that was at the core of Taiwan's defense strategy, but more importantly, it was at the core of its deterrence strategy as well. For China, trying to take Taiwan is difficult, but trying to take it while facing the entire US military is close to impossible. And so, as long as the US involvement looked likely, the threat of invasion was always relatively low. For China, it always made a lot more sense to try to get Taiwan to give up without a fight, especially since the cost of war with the US would be so high and the odds of success quite low. But since most Taiwanese seem to favor the status quo according to polls, which means maintaining their factual independence while not declaring it formally, the odds of China getting them to give up their sovereignty voluntarily were quite low as well. Hence, the fragile but relatively stable situation in which Taiwan's position strategically was not actually that bad. But with the US retreat from the world, that fundamentally changes. Without a credible chance that the US would come to its help in case of an invasion, Taiwan's strategic situation deteriorates immediately and very significantly. If Taiwan had to fight alone, assuming that Beijing puts all its resources into it and it's willing to accept massive casualties and fight for a long enough time, Taiwan's survival chances are very, very low. In a CSIS wargame which simulated the war over Taiwan and which was the most complex and reliable public wargame on this topic to date, China would lose in every single scenario in which the United States joins the fight. However, China also wins in every single scenario in which the US stays out of it, and Taiwan has to fight alone. Of course, anything can happen. For one, Taiwan has many advantages, and the war would not be easy at all for China nevertheless. And Ukraine, for example, was famously also expected to lose just to prove everyone wrong. But unlike Ukraine, Taiwan would be isolated from the beginning, and the population imbalance is also skewed so much more in China's favor than in the case of Ukraine and Russia, with China's population being roughly 60 times larger than Taiwan's, while the Russian population is roughly just 4 times larger than that of Ukraine's. Unfortunately for Taiwan, if you just look at the odds, a war with China on their own just doesn't end well. But paradoxically, I don't think that this would necessarily lead to a war. Instead, it might actually decrease the odds of a war over Taiwan happening. I want to take a quick break here to make a little announcement. I love maps. Historical maps, geographic maps, all kinds of maps. I've got a bunch of them on my walls, and there's just something about looking at a beautiful map that I find for some reason really satisfying. And because I also love geopolitics, I always wanted a map that would both look beautiful and actually have geopolitics as its focus, to capture and visualize balance of power. And since that didn't really exist, I decided to make one. It's called Geopolitics of the Western Pacific, and it's a physical, limited edition map print that I created together with a professional designer. It shows the strategic flashpoints of the region from Taiwan to North Korea and the South China Sea, and all the key bases, invasion routes, missile ranges, and everything else. And it's presented in a way that's actually beautiful enough to hang on your wall. I basically made it for myself, but if you're also a geopolitics and a map nerd, you might like it as much as I do. It's a very limited run, available only from now until a few weeks before Christmas or until it sells out. So if you'd like one for yourself or as a Christmas gift, you can get it now using the link in the description. And now, back to the video. The thing is that up until now, the likelihood of China deciding to take Taiwan by force, even if that meant fighting the US as well, was increased by the fact that it increasingly seemed like the only option China had left, because a voluntary decision by Taiwan to rejoin seemed less and less likely. Naturally, Beijing would much prefer to avoid a war if it can succeed through other means, but due to the reasons described earlier, the majority of Taiwanese seemed reluctant to voluntarily give up its independence, as long as they knew that the US had their back. But that calculus fundamentally changes the moment the US does not have their back anymore, or when it appears that way. Because while Taiwanese citizens might not voluntarily give up its independence, even if it means accepting a relatively low risk of a most likely successful war with the US on their side, that completely changes when the choice becomes to either give up its independence or face a high risk of a highly destructive war with a close to zero chance of survival. If that becomes clear to the majority of Taiwanese population that this is the choice they're facing now, the support for political parties that seek more peaceful relations with China and sort of a policy of China appeasement is likely to increase, while the support for the more pro-independence, China hawkish DPP party is likely to go down. And the only thing China has to do then is to implement a salami slicing strategy. Slowly but gradually increase pressure in its demands and force Taiwan, under a threat of war, to give up its independence one step at a time. And weirdly enough, this might be a preferred outcome for some politicians in Washington as well, at least for those who wish the US to withdraw from the world. In this scenario, a US president would be spared the need to decide whether the US would join the fight or not, and spared the backlash and a solid dose of humiliation in case they would decide to abstain and just watch from the sidelines. Instead, China would eventually reach the same, or arguably even better outcome, but slower, and in a much less visible and much less obvious way. Now, obviously, the things might not go the way I highlighted here, and this might not happen. Trump might be replaced by another president in 2028, one that would be more hawkish on China and more willing to help Taiwan. And Trump could also always change his mind and let both China and Taiwan know that the US would not stand aside. But by the time the former happens, it might be too late. The damage to the trust of Taiwanese citizens in the US protection might be beyond repair, and the unwillingness to fight for Taiwan might already be the new US bipartisan policy. And the latter is, at least the way I see it, highly unlikely. Trump seems to be very conflict averse in his second term, at least when it comes to powerful US adversaries like China and Russia, and completely unwilling to commit to anything outside the US borders. And so this, at the moment, and at least in my little book of personal forecasts, remains a plausible and not entirely unlikely scenario for the next 5 to 10 years. And we'll see if I was right or not.